Hello and welcome to week 7 here in Introduction to Sociology. And we're going to be discussing this week one of the hot topic, button pushing sort of topics that we have here going on in the US, and that is gender, sex, and sexuality. And be mindful that sociology is not in the business of judging whether a person's perceptions of gender, sex, and sexuality are okay or not. We are in the business of studying the occurrence of these things within our society. And we recognize that these are very important, not only in terms of our social structure and the sort of integrated aspects of our society that depend on gender, but that has a lot to do with a person's sense of self and their identity, what they feel, how they fit in, or how they perceive that they don't fit into traditional gender descriptions of different kinds. So we're going to be looking at this from the point of view of describing what is out there and not really getting into the idea of determining right and wrong, outside of the notion that, as a principle, self-expression of gender, whether a person is transitioning, refer to them as trans, or a person's sexuality, or their particular gender expressions, public and private, are considered valuable aspects of that individual and should be supported. I personally support the choices that people make in terms of their gender expression, and the college supports that as well. So policy-wise, these expressions are totally okay. And we need to be able to treat people with respect and treat people's choices with respect. So let's take a look at the chapter and see what our textbook in the world of sociology has to say about gender, sex, and sexuality. So I started off with a film that I would usually show in class, and this is an extremely good film by Jean Kilbourne, who is a media analyst and critic. And she talks about the portrayal of women in advertising and how the women's bodies have been basically dissected to sell products. It's a very, very powerful movie. If you have a chance to watch any version of it, this is the 4th one. The 3rd one's really good too. In the time that I've been teaching, I've shown both the 3rd and the 4th edition of this movie. So we move into making the distinction between sex and gender, looking at the different agents that teach us what those are, the social structures in our society that teach and maintain those definitions, and of course the idea of focusing on advertising and its effect. So one of the areas, and this is my own thinking in terms of providing some clarity as to how I approach these particular issues, is I see sex as biological, so that has to do with genetics and anatomy. And then we have gender, which is sociological, which is the definition of what do those mean? What does it mean that I have those, that genetics or that body, those body anatomy parts? What does that mean in terms of the norms, values, and expectations of my society? Those are the things that are kind of the focus here. Biology is important, and an individual's perceptions of their body, whether it's be in line or not in line with their perceptions of gender, what they align with, then that can be a challenge that that individual faces, and it can be a challenge that that individual faces in light of the rather rigid rules that society has about those things. And that's one of the primary things that that sociologists recognize, is that across, particularly in American culture, we have rather rigid rules about what men and women can do. Even in a modern society where there's all kinds of examples of people who are non-traditional, people who are, quote, non-binary, they are not really acting in ways that we can place into those 1 or 2 boxes. Even with all of that, there's still this systemic presence of concepts related to what is men's work and women's work. Even when we don't ascribe to those ourselves, evidence of the fact that this is systemic is that almost everybody could actually answer the question, what are traditional male and female roles in our society? Even if you don't believe in them, you could still describe them. And this is limiting for everybody. It's limiting for anybody, whether they ascribe to the need to having an alternate gender name for themselves or different pronouns, or whether they want to consider themselves, whether they're trans or not. Everybody still understands what they are. So that tells us how systemic these are. And I want just to draw that connection too between sociology and biology. There is a person's orientation, let it, whether it's gender or sexual orientation, has a biological root as well. So these orientations have to do with the way the brain is structured, what is somebody attracted to. The labels as to whether those are male and female are all sociological. So the person's behavior may be driven by biology and the biopsychology, the psychology of the brain and whatnot, but it enters into a world that is not so flexible all the time in terms of what somebody can and cannot do based on their sex, based on the label that they might have as sex. And thus we're seeing that social movement that's trying to say, hey, for one thing, I don't fit into those, so I'm going to create some new names to just accurately describe who I am and what I like and what I do and my particular orientation. And at the same time, we have to take a stark look at these very narrow viewpoints that we have in terms of what is male and what is female. Now, gender development is influenced by what we call social agents or agents of socialization. It's all the different groups that we belong to, the different societies and whatnot. So our family, of course, school, church, any one of those, or the military, the economy. When we look at societies, ways in which they transmit that information, we look at those structures, that's where we see that systemic thing. And that's where we get the idea of either I don't match that, or I don't identify with that, or I do identify with that. Those things get taught, even in egalitarian families. But for sure, an individual who is raised in a family that is okay with diverse gender expression, or like gender doesn't matter kind of thing. If you like trucks or if you like dolls, who cares, right? That's where you go, just to kind of like put it at like kind of base example. Those individuals grow up to be much more accepting of deviances from those more rigid roles that are there. Now, the other topic I bring up is sex and sexuality, which is sexual preferences, guess the traditional would be to opposite sex, but individuals can be attracted to both sexes, or they can be attracted to a person with the same sex. There's different ways in which other sexualities that exist, and these two are highly influenced biologically, and then they run up against these more rigid social values and social definitions of what gender and sexuality mean. One of the very obvious social movements within our society is the LGBT movements, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and then Q, questioning, plus, and there's other letters to kind of encompass that in that entire group. That is challenging these existing values of the total, much more distinction between men and women, and looking at other alternative ways to think about that. So in the discussion, I ask you to share a little bit about what have your social agents taught you? Where did you get your concept of that? I want to, however, be very careful in ensuring that you don't have to express your own. You don't even have to tell you the truth. I don't want to place anybody in a situation where like they're the only one in class that, has a different sense of point of view. My discussions are usually very self-disclosure oriented, and this one is one of those. And Self-disclosure is not necessary. You can talk about these in a third-person sort of way, in an objective way, if you don't feel comfortable kind of highlighting your particular. In the quiz part, I ask you to identify the difference between sex and gender, and to visit the idea of sex and gender in the media, particularly in advertising. It'd be interesting to see if you could find some examples out there. That would be great. You can actually insert images into your answers. So I'd really like to see you, go out there, find an image that's out there that exploits, or maybe one that's, trying to make things better in the advertising world, and post that as part of your answer. So that's how we're going to explore sex, gender, and sexuality here in sociology, and I will see you online.